Welcome to Chapter 9. In this week, we will do Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. So, Chapter 9 is a little bit shorter, Chapter 10 is quite a bit shorter, but together they're a little more than you're used to doing. We'll try to hit the highlights of this. Okay, we've added Cool here to the listening guide to help give you some something to hang on as you're doing the listening. I've also reorganized this so you can have a at your fingertips guide. um, we're still building our listening list. Required listening is about 25 minutes. Some things on here that are real distinctive, like The Girl from Ipanema, Blue Rondo a la Turk, Autumn Leaves by Bill Evans. Um, and there's lots of cool listening to do if you want to delve into it a little deeper. This is some examples of third stream and also some jazz, some classical composition in the jazz style, and a little bit of Brazilian. Okay, with no further ado, here we go. The direction of jazz is determined by three things: the men, their instrument, and the times. This quote is from Jazz World, and it helps us to point out that we just came out of swing and into bop, which was a very big contrast. And just as that was a contrast, cool also contrasts with bop. So we swing back and forth, the pendulum from one style to the next. Cool is different in that it's an understatement. It has lots of relaxed tempos, a lot of subtle instrument colors, reserved tonal style. It focuses on the group sound rather than the individual sound, and there's this attitude of emotional detachment. Cool also utilizes a chamber orchestra, but larger than bop, and it plays mostly to intimate settings. It's very delicate. It's focused on tonal colors. I'm going to refer you to the interactive guide on page 200. That should be very helpful to give you an idea of what to listen for. A little more of the characteristics about Cool. It incorporated some stringed instruments, the violin and the cello. And when you're talking about tonal sonorities or colors, they refer to Cool, and you'll see what we mean by as pastel as opposed to bop's fiery red kind of color structure. Another thing is that all of the jazz we've looked at for a while has been bound by a specific number of bars in the way it's constructed: 8 bars, 12 bars, 16 bars, 32 bars, particularly with the choruses. You know, the choruses run a predictable amount of measures. And Cool doesn't do that. It throws that away and it uses an extended form. Cool had lots of more conservatory trained musicians, and they had different skills. They used delicate attack. They used the middle registers of their horn instead of pushing it to the extreme ends of the horn. Played typically with no vibrato. That's that wavery sound, woo, and very adept at polyphonic harmonics. So we've seen that before in Dixieland. And here it returns, not so much with melodies, but also with harmonies here. Looking forward at the sound of Cool, we're looking at a chamber group, but a bigger chamber group than with bop. And we're looking at adding instruments that we haven't seen very frequently in swing or at all in some of these cases, Dixieland or any of the styles that we've seen. So we add the flute, oftentimes, French horn, double reed instrument like the oboe, cello, violin we've already mentioned, tuba, and a trumpet-like horn that's called the flugelhorn, that's much more mellow sound and a little bigger than the trumpet. Some of the other changes we see are in meters. We've been cranking out music, listening to music that's in 4/4 time, that 4/4 beat. And now we get things in 3/4, 5/4, 9/4. Sometimes they juxtapose and change meter right in the middle of things. We look for an interchange of key signatures. We look for choruses that are no longer symmetrical. And some people, for example, especially Dave Brubeck, incorporated use of polyrhythms, 2 different rhythms over top of each other, or polymeters, 2 different meters, different horns playing in different meters. Okay. And now we kind of look at what the public's view was on Cool, because it was sort of split. Some accepted it and others did not. And the ones that didn't, they thought the musicians were bored, arrogant, disdainful, cold, emotionally detached. The ones that loved Cool thought that the musicians were very creative, hardworking, they were serious. They didn't pull foolish stunts, clowning around out to impress like a lot of the swing bands had done as they popularized themselves on the touring circuit. Some cool bands. So first of all, we're going to look at some tactics that we've seen before that foreshadowed this cool style. And we're going to mention Benny Carter, who uh, incorporated underplayed attacks, as he started to note. Pianist Teddy Wilson demonstrated that delicate touch. Clarinetist Benny Goodman, he eliminated vibrato as opposed to Sidney Bechet. Miles Davis, his tone was very mellow and also lighter and more expressive. Um, George Shearing incorporated these really subtle bop licks, and we saw that Duke Ellington worked with orchestral colors, and we see that happening in the Cool too. Okay, some cool bands that we're going to talk about here. First, we're going to talk about Woody Herman and his Thundering Herd. He has a massive amount of recordings available, and over the years of his band, he uh, played in many styles, and so you'll hear lots of different things. But one of his signature features was this very tight sax section, and you can hear that if you listen to Four Brothers. He also, with one piece, Early Autumn, launched Stan Getz's career. Um, okay, another one was Claude Thornhill. He used Gil Evans as his arranger, and he had a tuba and a French horn in his band. Um, and then another person that we're going to talk about who didn't have a full band but often played in a quintet or a trio or backed a singer was George Shearing, who played. I actually heard him live once. He was classically trained pianist, and that translated very well for his cool style of jazz. Let's meet the performers. First and foremost, let's meet Miles Davis, who brought cool to the forefront. He worked with an experimental group of 9, Gil Evans's group, and they were mostly white players, but they were looking for a sound that wasn't as aggressive as pop. He became the leader because he had connections to get gigs, and his tone, that straight tone with very little vibrato, these long overarching melodic ideas, this kind of epitomized the cool era sound. He collaborated with Gil Evans. Gil Evans was the composer, and fortunate for us, they did. They brought us lots of brilliant music. Gil loved to write for stringed instruments and other non-traditional jazz instruments. He had a creative and subtle way of writing that was very effective. Moving on, Lenny Tristano. He was based in New York, and he formed a new school of music, also a pianist. His approach was very intellectual, and he influenced all kinds of people. Art Pepper, Bud Freeman, 2 people that we're going to talk about here again, Dave Brubeck and Bill Evans. He stressed the melodic structure over the emotional expression. His compositions were very complex. And not only did he influence the cool movement, but he also had influence in the free jazz period and also the jazz rock fusion period. Okay, next one that we want to talk about is Bill Evans. And Bill Evans, I have to say, if I could listen to just one jazz player, it would be Bill Evans. He was a classically trained pianist. He fulfilled this piano legacy that we've been seeing since the beginning of jazz. He had this trio that he played with that was just top notch. It was Paul Motian, a drummer, and a very young guy, Scott LaFaro, as a bassist. I think this trio was together about 3 years and was cut short when Scott LaFaro died in an automobile accident. And this really threw Bill into a tailspin. After that, he kind of got into drug addiction, and that really had an impact, not so much on his work, but it certainly shortened his life. And He worked best in small groups, the trio especially, although he played with other groups, quintets and quartets, and also the bands. Like one of the famous things is this kind of blue recording that's in our listening, and that was a collaboration with Miles Davis. He influenced every pianist that came after him. He was a soft-spoken guy, an introspective musician, and for as soft-spoken as he was, his voice was really prominent on the piano. He changed everything. He created new sounds for it. He had creative chord voicings that were very distinctively his, and he utilized different improvisational techniques than pianists that had come before him. Much more introspective and less bombastic technical virtuoso than others. Some other performers we want to look at: saxophonist Lee Kunitz, who taught in Tristano's school; Stan Getz, who had one of the most beautiful tenor sax sounds, and he played a little bit in the Stan Kenton band and around. And then a guy, Jimmy Guaffre, I'm not sure how to say that, but he, instead of playing tenor sax, he played clarinet in the lower register, and he developed this music that um, where the beat wasn't quite so prominent. It was more implied. There wasn't an instrument like a piano or a drum or a bass that pushed the beat, um, and it was very effective. I think there's a listening example on the additional sheet that you might want to listen to there. Okay, put together this slide for you so you can kind of see the legacy of piano that we've been looking at, from Scott Joplin down through Jelly Roll, James P. Johnson stride piano, Fats Waller, Meade Lux Lewis, Art Tatum. You remember Art Tatum was quite the technological pianist. And then in these more recent chapters, we've learned about Earl Hines, Duke Ellington, Bud Powell. We haven't talked about Horace Silver yet, but he shows up in this group in the Cool. Oscar Peterson often accompanied Ella Fitzgerald. He was quite the technician and a Thelonious Monk we've learned about. But to me, the most outstanding of them all was Bill Evans. Okay, now we move on to West Coast Jazz. West Coast Jazz developed at a place called the Lighthouse at Hermosa Beach. It was different than the East Coast of Miles. It was written specifically for players and their traits and characteristics that they brought to the music, back to the conservatory trained people looking for a new sound that was more introspective than bop. And it had a lot of characteristics of classical music that was being written at the same time, particularly Darius Milhaud's music and atonal music. West Coast jazz shared a lot of traits and characteristics with East Coast jazz: that introverted tone, the unique instrumentation, and that new ensemble sound that was usually through the color of instrumental groupings that the composers would pair together. The West Coast jazz players supplemented their incomes with the Hollywood studio orchestras, and a lot of them played in Stan Kenton's band. Here's an example of a group, the Jerry Mulligan and Chet Baker Quartet, that didn't have a piano in it, so they used very different instrumentation. Now we're going to move on really quickly to the third stream, which is simply jazz that uses classical forms, things like rondos, fugues, theme and variations. This is called third stream, and it's an extension of Cool, but it borrows heavily from classical music, particularly impressionistic music and earliest 20th century music. When Cool moved to more composed, formal, defined works, this is when third stream came to be. Two people are credited for it: Gunther Schuller, a composer, and John S. Wilson, also a composer. Third stream leans heavily on that fully composed tradition that we find from Western Europe, more so than the improvisatory oral tradition of West Africa. Two terms you want to be familiar with: crossover and fusion. A little bit about Gunther Schuller here. Some jazz to point out, and that where classical compositions use jazz elements, which is not third stream. It's its own thing, but it just borrows. And then we want to talk a little bit about the Brazilian wave, okay? Salsa, bossa nova, and some of those performers. And that's the week. Look for the Miles on this same strain. Miles Davis.